Throughout history, wherever there have been cults, there have been rituals. But certain groups of the past took their rituals to the extreme. We're not just talking about your average sacrifices, either. Think playing ball games to the death, using internal organs to predict the future, and hanging human limbs from trees. As it turns out, human history is littered with gruesome rites and ceremonies that would be totally unacceptable in today's world. Here are the most fascinating 20 ancient cults with gruesome rituals that wouldn't ever fly today. The Vikings wanted to keep their deities happy. They felt offering them sacrifices was a good way to do that. Such offerings were known as blot, which was thought of as a sort of exchange. Basically, if they sacrificed something, they thought they'd get something positive back, be it something like good weather or a bit of luck during a conflict. The blot offerings could be any number of things. They might give up a weapon, for instance, or maybe some tools or jewels. But in a more sinister turn, animals and even people might be in the running. Records show they would have been suspended from trees in sites considered sacred. Saaremaa, an island off the coast of Estonia, is home to a fascinating site. The Kali meteorite crater field is exactly as it sounds, an area shaped by a meteorite crash landing there long ago. Because it broke up as it hurtled down to Earth, the object from space left many craters on the island. The largest is Kali, which seems to have taken on a sort of religious importance for the people who once inhabited the area. Archaeologists have been interested in a wall around the Kali crater, which seems to have been constructed by a cult. Within the boundaries set by this wall, a significant amount of animal bones have been discovered. This suggests people were sacrificing animals here, at this site of cosmic significance. Thanks to contemporary festivals like Burning Man, the ritual of setting the wicker man alight has experienced something of a revival. Looking back, though, the practice traces back to the Celts, but it was a little more gruesome back then. That's because they were said to place animals and even people inside the structure before burning it. There is an issue with this account, though, as the best sources we have for it were prominent figures from ancient Rome. It's possible these Romans were just trying to paint their Celtic enemies in a bad light, suggesting they conducted these violent and frightening rituals. But there have been limited archaeological findings backing up the animal sacrifice claims, at least. When the Spanish were colonizing Central and South America, tales emerged about the horrifying practices carried out by the native Aztecs. Rumors of human sacrifices and terrifying rituals started to spread, but when we read these accounts today we need to be a little cautious. The Spaniards, after all, had an interest in blowing these tales out of proportion and negatively portraying the people they were displacing. We definitely shouldn't buy into the stories without skepticism, but there does appear to have been some truth to them. There is an increasing amount of credible evidence to suggest the Aztecs really did offer up humans for sacrifice. They did so, it seems, in order to feed Huitzilopochtli, a deity associated with the sun. Huitzilopochtli was at war with darkness, and if the sun god lost, the world would cease to be. The hearts and blood of human sacrifices, it was believed, could help Huitzilopochtli to win. Ancient Egyptians worshipped a deity called Sebek, who was responsible for the yearly flooding of the Nile. In practical terms, this river flood was essential for the success of the region's agriculture, so the people desperately wanted to ensure it all went well. So, they had to keep Sebek happy. The way the Egyptians sought to please Sebek may seem a little counterintuitive to us today. Sebek was part crocodile, which, for some reason, gave his devotees the idea that sacrificing real crocodiles would please him. So, they set about the very dangerous business of hunting and slaughtering the beasts. Evidence of this practice exists in the form of mummified crocodiles, which are displayed in some museums today. Way back in the 6th century lived a Roman historian by the name of Jordanes. He's thought to have descended from the Goths, which maybe explains his interest in those people as a historian. In any case, he did write about this tribe, notably about the reverence they held toward the war deity Mars. In an account titled The Origin and Deeds of the Goths, Jordanes elaborated on their gruesome way of worshipping their god. He wrote, "Now Mars has always been worshipped by the Goths with cruel rites, and captives were slain as his victims. They thought that he who is the Lord of War ought to be appeased by the shedding of human blood. To him they devoted the first share of the spoil, and in his honor arms stripped from the foe were suspended from trees." The early Slavic people of Central and Eastern Europe worshipped Perun, the mighty god of thunder. When Perun was pleased, the earth would be in a state of balance. Conditions would be agreeable, and food would be in abundant supply. When Perun was angry, though, things wouldn't be quite so good. It was important to keep the deity in a good mood, then. The Slavs figured the best way to keep on Perun's good side was to offer him blood sacrifices. These would usually take the form of a bull, but sometimes the offerings went further. If things were really bad and more desperate measures needed to be taken, then human beings were sacrificed. In parts of Asia, particularly in Japan, certain Buddhist monks were known to willingly undergo a most harrowing process. Basically, they'd adopt a specific diet that would reduce the moisture and fat content of their bodies, discourage the development of bacteria, and ward off insects. In other words, they were preparing for the preservation of their bodies while they were still alive. The monks would live like this for years, slowly starving themselves to death. But before they actually passed away, they would be laid inside a subterranean chamber and equipped with a bamboo tube through which they could breathe. They'd stay there for as long as possible, ringing a bell to alert people on the surface that they were still alive. When the bell stopped ringing, signifying the monk's death, the tube would be pulled out and the chamber would be sealed. 3 years later the body would be retrieved. If the monk's efforts had succeeded and the corpse had become mummified, it would be worshipped in a temple. The Eleusinian mysteries were a really important festival in ancient Greece, one in which even slaves could take part. They began at the start of September, but a huge amount of preparation would have taken place before that point. Participants were engaging in the rituals in order to worship the mythological figures of Demeter and Persephone, but there was a catch. Anyone who took part in the Eleusinian mysteries was bound to secrecy about what actually went down. If they ever revealed what happened during the festival, they would be killed. The stakes, then, were high. That means, of course, we still don't really know what the events entailed, but it does seem visions were a part of them. These hallucinations may have been caused by the consumption of psychedelic substances. Sounds intense. There's an account from 922 AD which details what happened after the death of a Varangian chieftain, and it's pretty messed up. The Varangians were Vikings, incidentally, known for their war-making and invasions. Anyway, when this leader died, it was arranged for a female slave to be buried alongside him, under the belief she would join him in the afterlife as his wife. The promise of a union with the chieftain in Valhalla seems to have been so desirable that this slave woman actively volunteered to be buried alongside her leader. So, a festival was arranged, and after 10 days of this she consumed a drink that intoxicated her. She was then killed by a priestess, and her remains were set alight beside those of the chieftain. The evidence would suggest this case was far from unique. For a long time, the royal tombs at Ur in southern Iraq were thought to have been the site of an epic scene of self-sacrifice. Skeletal remains inside the tombs seemed to belong to loyal subjects who had offered themselves up in reverence to their deceased leaders and willingly consumed poison. That was the theory for a while, but a different story is emerging these days. The evidence now suggests the subjects found inside the tombs weren't quite so laid back about their own deaths. Far from willingly consuming poison, it seems they may have been killed by something sharp. They were then subjected to an elaborate embalming process before being laid to rest in a ceremonial manner. Just as people today take sports seriously, the Maya also placed a lot of value on the results of their Mesoamerican balgam contests. But sometimes they went way further than we do. Usually, the losers of a game just had to deal with the humiliation of defeat. But in extreme cases, they paid for the loss with their lives. Sometimes the game could take on a ceremonial significance, where the two teams competing were representing good and evil. The stakes could be really high during such matchups, as the losers would be sacrificed. That gruesome measure could take the form of removing their heads or cutting their hearts out. Dionysus was a Greek deity with many strings to his bow. He was associated with things ranging from wine, vegetation, fertility, and theater, to insanity, religious ecstasy, and release. As you might imagine, then, that made his worship among devotees pretty interesting. And to be sure, plenty of cults arose in his name. Not much is known about the activities of a lot of these cults, but we do have a record pointing towards one group. This was a female-only collective whose members were called the Maenads, and they used to get pretty worked up when celebrating their god. Apparently, they used to get so stimulated they would literally tear up living creatures and consume their uncooked flesh. In ancient Greece, the role of the pharmakoi during the Thargelia festival was an unfortunate one. These were people who were used as scapegoats, and their experience was grueling. Basically, they would be selected based on how ugly they were perceived to be and mercilessly abused in the name of Apollo. Under the pretense that it would rid the society of misfortune, people would first of all dress the pharmakoi in figs. They would then feed them before being marched through the city. So far, not so bad. But this is when things took a turn, as the people would then begin to lash them with plants. Usually they'd ultimately drive them out of the city, but in extreme cases they'd kill them. The cult of Mithras remains largely mysterious to us today. We know it was based on the worship of the Roman deity Mithras, and we know rituals took place in temples we call Mithraea. But what adherents actually got up to within these places isn't entirely clear, though there are some theories. Archaeologists have painted a picture of Mithrists enjoying a big feast before burning the leftovers. Given that they'd have been eating things like pork and chicken, we're talking about a lot of bones here. They'd burn the bones and then spread the ashes out over the ground of the Mithraea. Next, they'd walk all over the ashes in their bare feet. In Fiji long ago, apparently, it was felt a woman should be totally devout to her husband even in death. The sign of a good wife, then, was one who would willingly follow her dead husband into the afterlife. For that to happen, she needed to be choked to death. This might be a decision a widow would take willingly. In fact, there's a tale about one woman who was in the process of being strangled when a settler saw what was happening and intervened. He drove away the people doing the deed, and he resuscitated the widow. When she came to, she was absolutely furious. The tomb of Fu Hao is quite the sight. Found in 1976 at Yingzhou in China, it is the resting place of the queen and military commander Fu Hao, who lived well over 3,000 years ago. The tomb was a rare find, in the sense that it was largely intact and still filled with its original contents. Fu Hao was laid to rest here with a bunch of items, including hundreds of jewels and metals and other precious items. Not only that, but the remains of 6 dogs were discovered here, too. These animals seem to have been sacrificed, but that's not even the worst of it. 16 human skeletons were also found, likely the remains of slaves who were offered up. The Yellow River is hugely significant to the people of northern China, and this can be seen in the region's ancient mythology. The river is linked to a deity named Hebo, around whom a cult developed. Extreme sacrifices were made by devotees to Hebo, including the taking of human lives. Young women were sometimes offered up to Hebo so they could become his wives. That, essentially, meant throwing them in the river and drowning them. It wasn't just human sacrifices, though, as animals were sometimes given up to the river god, too. This sort of ritual took place over a long stretch of time. On the Iberian Peninsula long ago, a people known as the Lusitanians used to worship a war deity called Karyosicus. The locals favored an especially gruesome form of sacrifice, one practiced on both animals and human captives. The reason they did this, though, was to try to predict the future. Basically, a priest would cut into a sacrificial victim's belly. The very way in which the victim then fell to the ground would be considered, and predictions would be made based upon it. They would also look at the victim's insides to try and discern the future from that. It sounds horrific and very, very strange. The ancient Romans and Greeks used to write the most appalling things about their enemy, the Carthaginians. Sources from these societies claimed the Carthaginians committed ritualistic sacrifices of children, an assertion which came to be disputed by experts in the 20th century. Contemporary historians viewed the claims as probable nonsense, as the Romans and Greeks would have had an interest in saying disparaging things about the Carthaginians. The thing is, though, new research indicates the Greeks and Romans might actually have been right. According to Dr. Josephine Quinn from Oxford University, it really does seem like the Carthaginians sometimes sacrificed babies. That's an horrendous thought, but one that Dr. Quinn wants to wrap her head around. In a statement, she said, perhaps it was out of profound religious piety, or a sense that the good the sacrifice could bring the family or community as a whole outweighed the life of the child. Thanks for watching, and don't forget to like and subscribe.